with no experience of time, do you think then photon is conscious, or does it even exist?
Why did God create so many sort of bad things like diseases which could easily not exist? This world was created by
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today we have Professor BarryDainton. He is an expert in philosophy of metaphysics, mind, and he's especially interested in concepts related to space and time. So thank you so much for giving us your time, Barry.
Well, not at all. I'm glad to be here and not used to the glare of publicity. It's the actually this room I taught in these rooms quite a bit, and that it's so much better light run dimmer because these lights are very harsh. But to read things, you need quite a lot of light. So, yeah. But anyway, welcome.
Thank you. So, what's your experience been with in the field of understanding space and time in general? Because I've heard a lot that. You are one of the most exposed person to physics in the philosophy department. You are one of the most exposed person to physics.
Quite possibly, yeah. Well, I guess it just goes back a long time. I've been reading popular science books always, really, and I was very much into science fiction as a kid. A teenager and still am, so I've always had that interest in what science has to say, and I guess it just derives ultimately from an interest in what the universe is like.
Right.
And with philosophy, metaphysics, and science, obviously have a lot to say about that. Now, some philosophers. Some metaphysicians think that the only good way of getting answers to a lot of questions is by pure philosophical reasoning. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to things like the nature of space and time, that's just obviously not true. Ever since the Copernican revolution, when we decided that the Earth wasn't at the centre of everything, that was largely. That huge shift was largely brought about by scientists rather than philosophers, although the distinction between the two wasn't completely clear at the time. And that's continued ever since. There have been huge advances. I mean, the Copernican revolution, 15th, 16th, 17th century, in Western Europe, a lot of discoveries were made then. Newton's physics got off the ground, but subsequent to that, there's been lots more really big new changes and discoveries. So it's been a constantly evolving field, and even more recently, I published the first edition of a book on space and time. I think it's called Time and Space, not very imaginatively, in 2000. When I came to do a second edition a few years later, I was horrified by how much had changed in just a few years. Yeah. People discovered, comparatively recently, very recently really, astronomers and physicists moved to something called the new standard model of the cosmos. And in that, ordinary matter only makes up about 5% of the total mass energy in the universe. All the rest is this stuff called dark energy, dark matter, both of which no one knows what they are. So it's a huge mystery opened up very recently. So I had fun writing about that. And it goes on with quantum theory and lots of implications potentially from some of the new quantum gravity theories. So it's just a fascinating area, really, and there's so many new things coming through.
It is. I mean, that's the reason when someone says that why I shifted from physics to philosophy, and I think these are the areas where, and I mean, this also leads me to a question, because then that's one of the most intriguing question that comes in mind, regardless of what field you're doing. And coming from a physics or scientific background would then make these questions much more interesting, is because physics in general is like they try to help us understand the most fundamental things in this universe, from which we can try and understand a lot of complex evolutions. But then there's a big question which comes in metaphysics as well. That is, what is consciousness? What is the nature of consciousness in general? And it's very hard for us, at least in science, to then justify consciousness, define consciousness, and then try and understand it through the lens of discoveries. So what's your opinion? Like, could consciousness be an intrinsic property of reality, or and any other theories?
And I guess consciousness, it's one of the things I've thought most about. Unlike quite a few of my contemporaries, I've just not yet been persuaded by any of the currently influential theories about how consciousness relates to the physical universe, the wider universe, and so on. I guess I'm just looking back at my career and what I've focused a lot of time on. I've been sort of both unlucky and lucky, and when I started off in the 1990s, 80s, consciousness was this kind of little subfield bit in philosophy that was, and psychology and intellectual life, in the kind of Western Anglophone sphere, at any rate, the kind of British, American, Australian kind of way of doing philosophy. Consciousness was just a non-topic. But I focused on it when I was doing my PhD, and came up with this theory of the self that was wholly consciousness-based. Then I spent a lot of time trying to work out in great detail what this particular consciousness approach to the self might add up to, the best way of developing it. So I spent ages working on the self and publishing this huge book in about 2008. And the luck and non-luck comes in that consciousness has been this really fashionable area ever since the 1990s, and in the 2000s this huge explosion of interest. The self in it has become this. When I first started working on it, was this very fashionable area. Lots of people were writing about it, and since then, it's not at all as trendy a topic as it used to be. I think these things have swings and roundabouts. So probably, I mean, the self, what kind of thing are you? Is this very fundamental question. Lots of very different answers, but. So since I've been unlucky or unlucky, but consciousness is definitely this sort of huge area. As for how it relates to everything else, as I say, there are all these different ideas, most of which still have defenders. I guess, like most people, I can see why a lot of people, I mean, if you took an opinion poll of adults in the entire world, it's been estimated that out of say 10 billion, 7 billion would say that we're souls, these non-physical entities that can survive the death of our bodies. That could be true. It's not decisively disproven, but it's not currently the most intellectually spectral view, largely because of puzzles about how something that's completely non-physical can relate to your body. Obviously, when we're conscious and thinking, and our bodies are constantly responding to how our minds are telling them to move. But how is that interaction possible between something that's a soul that is wholly non-physical, doesn't exist in space? So ever since the 19th century, mid-19th century, lots of philosophers have been trying to investigate kind of non-soul-based ways of understanding consciousness, or understanding consciousness, how it relates to everything else. For a strange combination of reasons, for a large part of the 20th century, partly under the influence of people like the logical positivists and the later Wittgenstein, consciousness became a kind of completely disreputable thing in philosophy. Well, that's changed radically. Among the currently fashionable ideas, I guess some people still think that you might be able to reduce consciousness, reduce the mind wholly to physical states, processes, as conceived by physics and chemistry. So your experience of colour and pain, what it's like to be you, is just a matter of physical, chemical processes. That's a kind of standard identity theory reductionist approach. I've just never found that at all persuasive or appealing. I mean, it just seems obvious that standard chemistry and physics just don't have any way of making sense of colour as we experience it, or pain as we experience it. It's sort of fundamentally different. These experiential properties just seem fundamentally different from ordinary physical properties. An alternative, which was dismissed for a long time, but now come back into fashion, is that consciousness isn't wholly separate from physical processes, physical stuff. Like the dualist and the soul theorist says, nor is it reducible to ordinary physical chemical processes. Instead, you could say that consciousness is in ordinary physical processes. So the kind of reductionist typically says something like, consciousness is a brain process. Consciousness is in effect confined to the kind of process that go on in brains. It's not found in tables, chairs, or atoms and molecules. The panpsychist, as they're often known, says, actually that's wrong. Yes, the physical processes in the brain are conscious, but so too is every physical thing. Every physical thing has consciousness as one of its intrinsic properties. So we take imagine an atom as a kind of little ball of sphere. It's you've got its kind of external properties like shape, how much space it's occupying. But what's it like inside the atom? One possibility is that maybe that's what is conscious. So just as when we experience colour, there's a kind of very special kind of property, the colour property. That kind of property is inside even the primitive elementary particles. And if we take this route, we've kind of we've got an answer to the question of how does consciousness relate to the physical world. It's just everywhere in the physical world. And I can certainly see the appeal of this panpsychist position.
So, but do you think that it is the fundamental nature of every particle, or is it kind of a separate entity, but then it expresses itself through these particles?
Well, for the kind of orthodox contemporary panpsychist, it's just a basic feature of physical stuff that it's got this interior nature that's consciousness, a form of consciousness. And the contemporary panpsychists have read a lot of popular science books, and they think that the current physical picture is that everything's made ultimately of fields, quantum fields, which spread throughout the entire universe. And particles, like electrons or quarks, are just vibrations in these fields. Like photon is a vibration, energization of the electromagnetic field. Other particles are energizations, patterns of activity in these quantum fields. And so we've got this picture that these quantum fields, which extend everywhere and give rise to physical things like tables, chairs, and planets, they are experiential.
But then don't you think that that kind of creates a problem for the uncertainty principle? Is because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but when we say that a particle is a disturbance in a smooth field, I mean, here's a disturbance, so we locate a particle here. And when we bring in the duality that anything is wave and a particle in itself, so considering a localization of wave as a particle, then that would not fit with the uncertainty principle, because we'll know the location and the velocity of the particle or the wave. Because if it is a disturbance at a particular location, we anyways know the location, and then it's traceable.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, it's a good point. I'm not quite sure that I've read much about how panpsychists would respond to that particular puzzle, quantum theory. And there are two. In one issue is how can the panpsychist kind of make sense of this duality, wave-particle duality? Another is, aren't they committed to everything having a definite location all the time? Another is how to reconcile panpsychism with the kind of quantum uncertainties, the kind of probabilistic nature of the theory. That's important. I mean, the modern panpsychists don't want to be revisionary in any way when it comes to physics. They want to say, physics tells us the truth about matter, and so everything we say has to be compatible.
Right.
So partly that means that the elementary particles, fields, whatever, behave in all the ways that physics says they behave. So it's not the case that particles have free will in the way a more complex being has. I mean, I can choose, I can decide to do this, do that. The particles are much more constrained than that. There's no predicting exactly what's going to happen when, say, two electrons bounce into each other. It's just this range of probabilities. And so the panpsychist says, that's how it is. So particles are just behaving in the ways that physics says they behave.
But then that would again, then I think panpsychists would also be more lean towards the deterministic idea of free will debate, because if we are made up of fundamental particles and every particle is behaving the way equations ask them to behave, then essentially we would also behave the same way, considering that every particle is also conscious. So then a more complex being having consciousness would then become free. I don't think so. Then that would be in line with what panpsychists say.
I'm not sure. I can imagine panpsychists can hold a whole range of different positions on the free will issue. I mean, some might say that when you put together trillions and trillions and trillions of elementary particles into brain-like configurations, you get this much more complex human-like consciousness evolving, rising, and this more complex entity could have forms of freedom open to it that the elementary particles don't. So I'm not sure. I mean, the whole issue of free will is still as controversial as anything in philosophy. Some people think that we're determined. Some people think we're not determined. Some people think that free will is compatible with determinism. Other people think it's not. And so I think panpsychists can probably adopt a whole range of different positions on that. But go back to the issue about whether things have to be localized or not. These different interpretations of quantum theory, which people are still debating, and the whole issue of how you make sense of quantum theory is incredibly uncertain and controversial. I mean, for a long time, the so-called Copenhagen interpretation dominated, that it's okay to say that there's no fact of the matter about how a quantum system is until you make a measurement or interact with it. And that is very hard to reconcile with panpsychism, probably. I mean, how can you make sense of a kind of a system that's in no particular state for a long period, possibly? How can Schrödinger's cat can be neither alive nor dead? And that's hard. If we're thinking the room where the cat is conscious, it's hard to imagine that there's no fact of the matter about what kind of experience is going on. There have always been kind of alternatives to that Copenhagen way of making sense of quantum theory. David Bohm, there's a kind of Bohm-Broglie interpretation which says, there is a fact of the matter about where particles are always, and it's guided by this kind of hidden quantum field, or kind of a field that's additional to the normal quantum fields. And everything's deterministic. Now, it's perfectly possible for panpsychists to go for that kind of interpretation of quantum theory. And I think in his most recent book, Philip Goff, one of the leading recent panpsychists, says that's his preferred interpretation of quantum theory, this kind of Bohm-Broglie alternative.
Right.
Another option is to go for the many worlds interpretation of quantum theory, which says you have, in the kind of Schrödinger's cat case, where you have this cat that could be alive, could be dead, because no one's looked at it yet. In fact, the whole universe splits. In one universe, you've got a live cat, and the other universe, you've got a dead cat. And so the universe is constantly splitting, but it's always determinate in one universe. Again, panpsychists could easily go for that interpretation.
Interesting. But then the limitations are, I mean, the splitting of universe will then be limited to probabilities and might not go beyond that? So it is still determined by probabilities?
I think I'm not quite sure how it works, to be honest. I've never really managed to make complete sense of it, but I think the idea is that if quantum theory gives you a kind of probabilistic curve like that, with a whole bunch of higher probabilities in that part, right, there'll be more universes corresponding to that part of the curve, a few universes branching off corresponding to the latter. kind of low probability ends.
Right. Interesting.
Well, I guess that this whole multiverse issue has become another of these areas where the physics and philosophy have converged in a way. Because some philosophers have always argued, well, not always argued, but recently argued that the multiverse is a good way of solving various problems. This idea that our universe is just one, a vast number of different universes we can't contact. It's a very extravagant idea, but it helps solve some problems. A certain quantum theory that makes problems as well.
Yeah, could be. Then coming back, going to another article that he wrote, and that seemed really interesting to me. You said that our reality is a video game to talk and solve for the problem of evil. So, like, if you can just tell us in a simple word what exactly is the problem of evil, and then we'll go deeper into that.
The problem of evil is the kind of label given to the issue of well, suppose that you think that our universe was created by a very powerful being. And you also think that this very powerful being, God, is not just powerful enough to create our world, but also good. So very intelligent, as intelligent as it's possible to be on the kind of standard Western theistic view. God has this power, has these attributes of being supremely intelligent, supremely morally good, as well as supremely powerful. God has all this power to create anything he wants, but God is also morally far better than any human. Now, if you want to believe, there are lots of people who want to believe in that kind of God. It's the kind of God of Orthodox Christianity. It's always had this problem of how you can reconcile that hypothesis that the universe was created by a being that's extremely good and extremely powerful, with the fact that our universe has lots of imperfections. And this problem of reconciling all the ways, the apparent imperfections of our universe with the hypothesis that it was created by a being who's maximally good and maximally powerful is called the problem of evil.
Right.
Evil's a kind of undesirable thing. What's called an evil in this kind of area of philosophy, theology, is something, a way the world could have been better. So the total quantity of pain being felt by humans and animals, that's an evil. The fact that people are exposed to human psychology is such that quite often we're very nice to each other, but quite often that we kill, rape other people, we launch wars on other countries. There are lots of ways people behave very badly. All these horrible illnesses that kill untold numbers of people. It's not always recognised that in many ways the current century, the current last 50 years has been the best that humankind has had. At least when it comes to public health. For most of human history, there were huge numbers of diseases that wiped out vast portions of the population at a very early age. So the average life expectancy in most countries these days, even the kind of less developed ones, is 60, 70, 80, whereas for most of human history, it's about 30 or 35. People were just wiped out by horrible diseases like smallpox, all the childhood diseases. I mean, these days, there's huge amounts of money put into researching things like cancer, which still can't be cured always. But we've had huge success against a vast array of other illnesses. So one question is, why, if our world was created by this supremely good and supremely powerful being, why did God create so many sort of bad things like diseases which could easily not exist? And then the natural disasters like earthquakes and tsunamis. So there's a whole range of bad things that, if you believe in God, you've got to explain.
Right. And correct me if I'm understanding it wrong, but in that article you said that our reality is sort of a video game, and the evil is nothing but flaws or challenges or sort of some glitches.
Glitches? To appreciate, well, I mean, the basic idea is that we can solve the problem of evil by recognizing that thanks to advances in science and technology, until very recently, the idea that human beings might, in a way, have the power of gods to create worlds of their own, just absurd. I mean, in the 19th century, even chunks of the 20th century, the idea that human beings could use technology to create a reality similar to this one, it's hard to take seriously. But that's now changed thanks to advances in science and technologies. Now, lots of people think that this may well happen, or certainly be possible. So if it's possible for human beings to create artificial worlds, then we've got this, and the artificial world could be very much like the reality that we seem to be in at the moment, just as complex and rich, seemingly full of other people. So let's suppose that's possible. We've now got an alternative solution approach to the problem of evil, namely that if someone says, well, how come God created a world like this one with so much suffering, problems and pain and unnecessary problems? The answer is no, God didn't create this world. This world was created by, say, other humans or some other agency that had the power to create the world, but wasn't maximally good, didn't have God's attributes. God wouldn't create a world like this. God would create a world that was much better in all sorts of ways. So the answer to the question, why is this world so flawed and so full of problems, that was, God didn't do it. God did create a world, but it wasn't this one.
But then question arises that if, let's assume that God created this entity that created this world, then the question comes, will God allow the entity to create a world like this? Because if God created the world of that particular entity to be very good, very better, much better than this, then why would the entity create a world worse than what they live in?
Well, the answer to that, the answer that you can make, I mean, that's a very good objection. But the orthodox standard theist person who believes in God. Going back at least to St. Augustine in about the 4th century, so that we have, in understanding what sort of trying to grapple with this problem of evil, it's important to divide evils into two categories. On the one hand, you have so-called natural evils. These are things like diseases, earthquakes, tsunamis, things that occur because the physical world is designed in a certain way, limited in a certain way. Then there's so-called moral evils. These are the kind of things that I mentioned at the start. The tendency of some humans to cause pain to other humans, not get on with them, behave sort of murderously, rape, robbery, all the kind of ways that humans can behave badly. Now, when it comes to the moral evils, the theist can say, you might think that God could have made it better, made it so that we didn't choose to do all these bad things. But God decided to make human beings free. He created us as beings with this freedom to choose between good and evil. He told us what the good ways of behaving were, and a lot of people go along with that. They freely choose to act in the way God says is good, but some people don't. But God couldn't make the people who behave badly quite often behave good all the time without eliminating, curtailing their freedom. If God's going to keep us free, then there's always going to be the possibility that some people will behave badly in ways that God doesn't approve of. So assuming this picture is correct, at least in the world that God created originally, the world where the people who built this world exist, he created them as free agents. They got as much freedom as we have. And so, some people in this world may think that creating worlds like this one is a dreadful thing and not do it. But other people might not agree with that. They might think, creating worlds like this is great, I'll do it. And we end up with a world like this. Now, God could have stopped it, but not without curtailing their freedom.
So then freedom becomes a much more bigger virtue of goodness than the kind of goodness we expect humans to behave, I suppose. Because I'm thinking in this lens, like if God would have restricted every one of us to only be good, then the act of not allowing us to be free is itself an evil act, and which is not done by us, but which is done by the God whom we consider all good.
Yeah, I think that's how Orthodox theists.
Yes, so my point is that in this argument we assume that the act of allowing us to be free is much more virtuous than the evil act we perform by being free.
Yeah, it's a fundamental good that, by forcing us to behave well and share all our wealth or not ever behave badly, violently, God could reduce the amount of suffering. But the world would be worse from a kind of deep moral perspective because we'd be like robots. We wouldn't be freely choosing what to do. God would become to make a choice. God channels us down this good path. is that an overall way? The thesis is, there'd be less suffering in a world like that, but overall the world is less good because a world that people can choose freely is much better than a world like with just these robots.
Right. Interesting.
So that's how the argument sort of unfolds. But it does depend on it being possible to create worlds using something like our science and technology to create virtual worlds.
Interesting. So then what's your current favorite topic in the field of metaphysics then? Like, what's your current topic which you find very interesting?
I guess, my own research the last few months, I've been working on an idea I had ages ago, which in a way connects up the nature of consciousness with the nature of time. So basically, I want to establish or make a kind of plausible case for thinking that the structure of the universe is exactly the same as the structure of our consciousness of time. All the different kind of ways of thinking about different theories about what our consciousness of time involves. Some people think our consciousness is just this kind of instantaneous slice, and that if you put lots of slices together, you get your stream of consciousness. But I've always found that implausible and argued that a theory, well, the various people have defended it, but basically that our consciousness of the present is in fact extended over, say, a second, perhaps a bit less. And this is known as the kind of extensional theory of the species presence, our immediate experience of presence. And when it comes to your whole stream of consciousness, then it's an idea I think at least goes back to William James, the kind of American philosopher psychologist. These species of presence actually partially overlap one another. So you have one there, the next one, the next one, the next one. And so why can't the universe be like that? Now, when it comes to the metaphysics of time, and so these very different views that philosophers take seriously, and I think actually, this division of views, the amount of different cosmologies, different stories, different theories about just the nature of the whole universe, which are just as diverse and interesting as anything physics have come up with. So when it comes to the nature of time and the universe, one theory, probably the common sense theory, is that only the present exists. That we've got this moment replaced by this moment, but the past is just gone. It's just this non-entity, it's kind of non-being. And the future doesn't exist either. It's just not. There's just nothing there in the future. But the present just keeps advancing one present at a time. So that's the kind of presentist position. Then you've got a growing block view that says, the present is constantly being replaced by a new present, but the past exists and it's just as real as the present. It's just... So when the present comes into existence, it doesn't cease to exist. It stays around, but it's not present because of new bits being added.
Right. So that's how we also then go and define memory of the past.
Well, I think all these different theories have to be able to make sense of things like memory.
Right.
But the third theory is currently probably the most influential among scientists and philosophers. It's often called the block view or eternalism. And this is the view that past, present, and future are all equally real. Mm. So it seems like we're confined to this little strip, but in fact, the future is just as real as this little strip of presentness, and the past is just as real. Right. Now, this view is hugely different than the presentist view. Mm-hmm. Well, all these different theories claim to be able to make sense equally well of both the science and everyday experience.
Right.
So,
interesting. So then, how would you define the experience of photon? Because according to Einstein, photon does not experience time, and with no experience of time, do you think then photon is conscious, or does it even exist? Because we see the effect of photon every time, but then photon itself.
Photons are very hard to make sense of, but yeah. I mean, something an article I wrote fairly recently about it kind of connects up kind of physics with panpsychism. Because the panpsychist says everything in the universe has some form of consciousness. The article was called "The Silence of Physics," because that's a phrase used by Galen Strawson, one of the main contemporary defenders of panpsychism. And he often talks about the silence of physics, meaning by it that when it comes to the intrinsic nature of anything, an electron, brain, field, the panpsychist is saying that physical entity has a kind of experience, this kind of a flow of colour or sound or something, and that experiential property is not recognised by science. But Strawson says, yeah, it's not recognised by science, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Because nothing physics or science has to say is any relevance to whether or not a particle is conscious or not. That's the silence of physics. When it comes to whether something can be conscious or not, physics just has nothing to say. Hence, but yeah, maybe that's not true.
Interesting.
And part because the problem you just mentioned, I raised in the paper, several problems. I could, but just to focus on the light issue. According to Einstein's special relativity theory, the universe divides into things which travel at the speed of light and things which don't travel at the speed of light. And for things, if you're traveling at the speed of light, then basically time ceases to pass. You become this kind of timeless entity. So whenever a ray of light sets off from a distant star, from its point of view, it arrives the same time it sets off, because just no time passes at all. So let's just suppose that's right. Then isn't that timelessness of light reconcilable with the panpsychist view that everything's conscious, including light? Because lots of philosophers, including people like Strawson, accept that consciousness is this essentially temporal, flowing, changing phenomenon, and you can't have timeless consciousness. So we've got this problem about, for the panpsychist, that given what physics says about light, it seems like light can't be this temporal, unfolding, flowing thing.
Right. But then I'll be more happy if there's any theory that comes and tells that, sorry, Mr. Einstein, you were wrong. Speed of light could be the fastest thing, but then time is something beyond that. Because it's hard to imagine, it's hard to even accept that we talk the distance and everything in light years, but then light itself does not experience any sense of time. So it's pretty it's pretty wild to imagine, although there's nothing that has kind of given a firm sense of contradiction to Einstein. So hope for the future. So I mean,
well, no, I'm just setting aside the light panpsychism problem. I mean, a lot of people think the reason for going with this eternalist block universe is Einstein. So if you want to say that only the present is real, you've got to explain why that is wrong. That in fact, nothing in physics rules out presentism.
right.
So I think there are ways of doing it, and but yeah, that's another task.
Right. So I mean, do you have any questions for me?
How plausible do you find some of these theories? I've just been discussing things like panpsychism, and do you think it's plausible that every physical thing is conscious?
I mean, I would go in a more realist ideology, because it's more like, I mean, I would believe this if I would have not been exposed to AI, because now we see that there's a huge possibility of AI developing a more complex level of consciousness, if considering the current AI is not conscious or conscious in a very fundamental way. But I mean, the kind of complex task it does, and the kind of complex tasks we expect it to do in the future with development of technology, I would tend to be more of a realist, considering that everything combined in a more complex way would generate consciousness as a byproduct, and not something which is inherently in every particle. Because I find it more possible to believe by seeing these kind of developments.
No, I think the recent developments have just been very... Well, it came as a surprise to me, because I've been talking about AI and PhilosophyOfMind classes for years. There have been false dawns, and all of a sudden things have changed quite dramatically. So no, I can fully see why recent advances might make you think about things differently.
Right.
So you take seriously the idea that this reality could be a bit like a video game being run in some future supercomputer.
I mean, that is something it's hard for me to believe in one thing, or think that one thing can be possible, because I mean, I used to think in a similar way in my childhood. I mean, when I got first exposed to the idea of universe, I think that, okay, maybe this entire universe isn't just one electron, and that electron is again a part of another big universe, and then there's this all complex development over it. I mean, starting to think about these concepts through such ideas, I mean, I find the idea of video game more equally plausible with the idea that we are living in a much more real world, and it is not any sort of matrix or video game, but it is much more real. I find both of them plausible because maybe I'm yet to experience something much more stronger to make me believe in one of these things.
So what kind of stronger thing might kind of persuade you one way or the other? Would it be some kind of special kind of experience, or encountering something, some discovery made in science or philosophy?
More than that, I mean, I would prefer more being a part of an experience which can be very difficult to be experienced, which would be very difficult to explain as a part of being a real world. Then I think that would make me delve more into the side of the world being much of a video game or matrix.
So you think there are signs that this isn't the kind of real reality?
I mean,
The world couldn't be like this, and it be the ultimate, all there is. Does it seem that you have this sense that there might well be?
I think both being more real, because I mean, I can try and find persuading ideas for me to believe in both of these being right. So that's why, I mean, I would leave myself to the future, to more experiences to make me then think deeper, to persuade myself in one or the other way.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, thank you so much. It's been lovely having you. Thank you so much for your time, though.
Well, thank you, and thanks for selecting a few things to talk about. It's been fun. And
Sure. Thank you.